Does this old man really think he deserves to sit in business class? The voice rang out across the airplane cabin, accompanied by contemptuous stares, mocking laughter, and a chilling final line. Your time is long gone. Seat 16A became a public execution ground, where an old man's dignity was torn apart simply because he looked unworthy. No one stood up, no one intervened, and the bully was convinced he was winning. But just a few seconds later, in a single moment, the sky changed its tone. Two F-35 fighter jets appeared. The radio crackled to life. An old code name echoed out, freezing the entire cabin. Those who had been laughing suddenly fell silent, as the truth reversed everything most brutally. That old man was not an ordinary person. He was Ghost. So the question is, if you were the old man in seat 16A, would you bow your head in silence, or would you let the truth speak for itself? If you were the one abusing power, would you dare to face it? When history turns back and looks you straight in the eye, do not just watch and scroll past. Press follow, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your perspective, because stories like this are not meant for those who stand on the sidelines. The business class cabin of the flight from Washington, W1C, to Los Angeles carried a very particular atmosphere, where the scent of new leather seats, blended with expensive perfume, and the excessive self-confidence of people accustomed to special treatment. Silence there did not come from courtesy, but from the habit of looking at others with half an eye, as if every passenger had placed themselves on an invisible hierarchy. Snippets of conversation about contracts, investments, and emerging technologies drifted through the air, loud enough for others to hear, subtle enough to signal that they belonged in this place. Amid the stream of passengers entering the cabin, the old man appeared, with almost no one paying attention. He walked slowly, pulling a small suitcase, stopping in front of a window row, and bending down to check the seat number. Seat 16A. He sat down, placed the suitcase close to his feet, and leaned back as if he had been familiar with this feeling for a long time. On his wrist was an old pilot's watch, its glass marked by a thin diagonal crack, the hands still moving steadily. He looked out the window, where the runway stretched under the sunlight, and let out a very soft breath. At that moment, Mr. Harris's gaze stopped at seat 16. Harris was about 35 years old, wearing a neatly pressed shirt, his sleeves rolled up to reveal a shiny smartwatch. He tilted his head, looked at the old man again, then slightly frowned, as if he had just noticed a stain on a brand new shirt. The standards in this cabin are getting lower and lower, Harris said, his voice not loud but clear enough for nearby passengers to hear. He did not look directly at the old man, instead staring ahead, as if the remark were a general observation, aimed at no one in particular. The old man continued looking out the window. He did not turn his head, nor did he change his posture. The distant hum of the engines echoed steadily. Harris leaned toward the aisle and pressed the call button for a flight attendant. When the young woman appeared, he spoke immediately, his tone cold and sharp. Are you sure this old man isn't sitting in the wrong seat? This is business class. The flight attendant hesitated for a moment. She quickly glanced at the seating chart, then looked at the old man. Her eyes lingered on his jacket, worn at the shoulders, on the small suitcase without any prominent logo. She pressed her lips together, trying to keep her voice polite. Sir, let me check again. Harris leaned back in his seat, folded his arms, and curled the corner of his mouth into a smirk. I paid for a quiet seat, he continued, this time no longer hiding his irritation. Not to sit next to people who are past their expiration date. The words caused the surrounding air to sink. A few passengers paused their conversations, glancing over before looking away again, as if they did not want to get involved but could not claim complete innocence. The old man turned his head and looked at the flight attendant. There was no confusion in his eyes, no anger. He handed over his boarding pass, his voice low and slow. I am in the correct seat. The flight attendant took the ticket, checked the seat number, and nodded. Yes, sir. Seat 16, A is indeed yours. Harris let out a soft laugh, short but dripping with sarcasm. Paperwork is always correct, he said, but there are things that are not reasonable just because the paperwork says so. Beside the old man, Anna clenched her hand against the armrest. She looked at Harris, her face flushed, caught between embarrassment and anger. My grandfather is sitting in the right seat, she said, her voice trembling but clear. Could you watch what you say? Harris turned to Anna, appraising her from head to toe. Who are you? He asked, traveling with him, or his caregiver. Anna stood up abruptly. My grandfather does not need a caregiver, and you have no right to speak like that. A heavy silence settled over the business class cabin. The flight attendant stood between the two sides, awkwardly, holding the ticket and unsure of what else to say. Harris looked around, as if searching for agreement. Some people avoided his gaze. Others pretended to focus intently on their phones or the screens in front of them. I built my company from nothing, Harris continued, his voice slightly louder. I create jobs. I pay taxes. I represent the generation that is pulling this world forward. And people like him. He glanced toward the old man. What have you done other than leave us a mess to clean up? Anna was about to say something, but the old man raised his hand and gently placed it on her arm. The touch was not strong, but it was enough to make her sit back down. He turned to Harris and smiled very faintly. It's all right, he said. Let him talk. That response seemed only to make Harris more confident. See, he said, even he understands. There is no place in this era for outdated things. The old man did not reply. He turned back to look out the window, where the pale blue sky stretched wide. The watch on his wrist reflected the light softly. The second hand kept moving steadily, neither fast nor slow. Anna lowered her head, her teeth clenched. She felt every word from Harris slam straight into her chest, yet her grandfather's eyes remained calm, as if those words could not reach him. The air in the business class cabin grew thick. Every gaze, whether direct or furtive, was drawn toward seat 16A. Some were curious, some irritated. Others wore the familiar indifference of those accustomed to standing on the sidelines. Harris leaned farther back into his seat and adjusted his cuff. Before turning away, he tossed out one last remark, his tone casual but sharp as a blade. If this is business class, he said, then I suppose the nursing home will be boarding flights soon, too. The words dropped into the cabin like a heavy object. The old man remained there, in seat 16A, quietly gazing at the sky ahead as the plane began to taxi, carrying with it both contempt and things no one in the cabin could yet foresee. The business class cabin, after Harris's remark, did not become louder. On the contrary, it sank into an uncomfortable stillness. The people who moments earlier had been boasting about contracts and profits suddenly fell silent, as if someone had drawn an invisible curtain separating them from the scene unfolding in row 16. The steady, low hum of the aircraft engines became more audible, pushing a sense of tension down the narrow aisle. Harris leaned toward Anna, his gaze lingering on her longer than necessary. Are you a caregiver? He asked, his voice carrying a veneer of feigned curiosity. Or a granddaughter hired by the hour? Anna snapped around. My grandfather is a legitimate passenger, she replied, struggling to keep her voice calm. You should leave other people alone. Harris laughed. Legitimate. He repeated the word as if it were a ridiculous concept. Do you know what legitimate means? Here, it is not just about a ticket. She sprang to her feet, one hand gripping the back of the seat in front of her. You are insulting others, Anna said, and you are doing it in front of this entire cabin. A few passengers turned their heads. One person looked at Anna with a brief, encouraging glance, then quickly looked away. Harris noticed the attention and relished it. He slammed his hand down on the armrest, the sharp sound echoing in the enclosed space. I build startups, he said more loudly. I create jobs. I pay taxes. I represent the future that all of you are benefiting from. He pointed toward the old man. And what about old military men like him? He asked, his tone full of defiance. What did they leave behind besides war? Besides worn-out stories to comfort themselves? The air in the cabin seemed to freeze. A middle-aged man in the row ahead gave a slight shake of his head, then turned away. Another woman pulled her headphones higher, as if music could block out the discomfort. A flight attendant stepped forward a pace, as though she wanted to say something. Her eyes flicked to the VIP tag attached to Harris's seat. She paused, inhaled, then stepped back half a pace. Sir, she said softly, her voice lacking certainty. Please keep order. Harris looked at her, a thin smile appearing on his lips. Just do your job, he said. I am your customer. Anna turned to the flight attendant. You cannot let this continue, she said. He is humiliating other people. The flight attendant lowered her head, avoiding Anna's gaze. I am very sorry, she replied. I will report it. Only then did the old man turn to Anna. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a touch light enough not to draw attention, yet firm enough to convey a message. Sit down, child, he said, his voice low and even. There is no need. Anna bit her lip. But Grandpa, it is all right, he repeated, his eyes still calm. Let him talk. Harris watched the scene, the smile on his face widening. See, he said triumphantly. Even he knows he should keep quiet. The old man did not respond. He turned back toward the window, gazing at the thin streaks of cloud drifting slowly in the distance. The watch on his wrist faintly reflected the cabin light. The second hand continued its steady movement, as if time in his world were unaffected by the words just spoken. Harris leaned farther back into his seat, as though he had claimed additional space. You know, he said to Anna, though his eyes remained forward, your grandfather's generation likes to talk about sacrifice, but this world runs on data, on speed. Anyone who slows down gets left behind. Anna looked at her grandfather. His composure made her feel both reassured and pained. Do you think speed gives you the right to look down on others? She asked. Harris chuckled softly. Power gives me that right, he replied. And power comes from leading, not from clinging to the past. A man seated behind Harris tilted his head, as if about to say something, then stopped. That silence felt like an unspoken agreement. Harris noticed and continued. You like old stories because they make you feel important, he said, but this world does not operate on memory. The old man exhaled softly. It was a light breath, almost unnoticed. He adjusted the position of his wrist, as if to let the watch rest more comfortably. Anna watched the motion and suddenly recalled evenings when he sat quietly by the window at home, with the same gesture, the same calm demeanor. The flight attendant returned, standing at the head of the aisle, but did not come closer. She looked at Harris, then at Anna, her expression uncertain. Harris shot her a glance, enough to make her turn away. Your time is long past, Harris said, his voice lower this time, yet loud enough for those nearby to hear. He leaned close toward seat 16A, as if to ensure the words reached the person meant to hear them. The old man continued to look out the window. Outside, the sky stretched wide, pale, blue, and quiet. Inside the business class cabin, eyes continued to avoid one another, backs pressed deeper into seats, and an invisible distance formed between seat 16A and the rest. Harris reclined, adjusted his seatbelt, as though everything had ended according to his wishes. Anna sat still, her hands clasped together, feeling her heartbeat gradually slow to match her grandfather's breathing. She did not know what would come next, only that this silence was not an ending. The aircraft continued its taxi, carrying within the business class cabin not only passengers confident in their own status, but also a tension that had not yet settled, like a low cloud, hanging suspended directly above seat 16A. The old man's silence did not soothe the business cabin. It was like a void that made Harris's next words ring clearer, sharper, and more irritating. He leaned fully back into his seat, one arm resting on the armrest, his eyes flicking toward the old man's wrist, as if he had just found yet another reason to continue. Look at that antiquated watch. Harris laughed loudly, his laughter dry and echoing. Does that thing even still work, or is it just for nostalgia? A few people turned their heads, some frowned slightly, others pressed their lips together. Anna clenched her teeth, her fingernails digging deep into her palm. She had seen that watch many times in her life, had watched how her grandfather always adjusted it before leaving the house, but she had never seen it become the target of mockery like this. You probably used to fly things without radar, Harris went on, his voice full of self-satisfaction. Back then, it must have been fun, flying through fog and calling it bravery. Anna turned toward him. That's enough, she said, her voice growing hoarse. You don't know anything about my grandfather. Harris glanced at her and shrugged. I know enough to see that he doesn't belong here, he replied. Business class is for people who lead the world, not for old memories. The old man lifted his hand and gently brushed the cracked glass of the watch. The movement was slow, familiar, as if he had done it thousands of times. The second hand kept moving steadily, each small tick cutting through the silence in the cabin. He looked at it for a moment, then turned his gaze back toward the window, where white clouds stretched beneath the wing. Anna felt her throat tighten. She felt tears rising, hot and hard to hold back. She did not want to cry in front of Harris, and even more, she did not want her grandfather to see. She turned her face away and took a deep breath, but Harris's words still clung to her. You see, he said, as if explaining something obvious, that generation likes silence, because silence is safer than admitting they've become outdated. A few rows behind, Claire sat upright, her laptop open on the small table. Her fingers typed a few quick lines, her eyes never leaving seat 16A. She did not look at Harris, nor at Anna, but focused on the old man, as if comparing the present image with a memory or a piece of information that had existed before. A young man on the opposite side of the aisle whispered to the person next to him. Why doesn't anyone say anything, he asked, his voice low enough to avoid attention, but loud enough to spread a shared discomfort. The other person shrugged and stared forward, as if the question did not need an answer. Harris heard the whisper. He curled his lip, taking it as a sign that he was controlling the space. "You're silent because you understand," he said arrogantly. "Here, everyone knows their value." Anna turned to her grandfather. "Grandpa," she said softly, "we can ask to change seats." The old man shook his head very slightly. "No need," he replied. His voice was low and even, carrying neither fatigue nor defiance. "Sitting here is fine." Harris chuckly. "Hear that," he said. "He knows his place, too." Claire stopped typing and looked up from the screen. Her eyes were sharp, focused, as if she were seeing something beyond this small dispute. She glanced at Harris briefly, then turned back to the old man. On her laptop screen, lines of text appeared and disappeared, as if she were trying to piece together an unfinished story. A flight attendant walked past, slowed for a beat, then continued. She avoided looking toward row 16, avoiding both Harris's gaze and Anna's. That avoidance made the air feel heavier. Harris tilted his head and looked toward the front of the cabin, where several other passengers were pretending to focus on their entertainment screens. "This world runs on people who dare to speak," he said, as if lecturing, "not on people who hide in silence." The old man did not turn back. He looked outside, where the sky was higher, brighter. He spoke softly, his voice so low, it almost blended with the engine noise. "Not yet." Anna heard it, even though it was faint. She turned toward him, wanting to ask more, but his eyes remained fixed outside, calm, as if the sentence needed no explanation. Harris did not hear it, or if he did not care. He adjusted his seatbelt and leaned his head back against the seat, satisfaction clearly written on his face. To him, the old man's silence was a sign of victory, a confirmation that his power was enough to overwhelm. Behind them, Claire closed her laptop and placed her hand on the lid. She looked out the window, following the direction of the old man's gaze. Outside, the sky opened wide, a vast, serene blue. She felt a strange sensation, as if she were standing on the edge of something about to happen. The business cabin gradually returned to its usual rhythm, the clink of spoons against cups, the soft rustle of newspaper pages, the glow of screens lighting up. But beneath that familiar activity, a vague sense of anticipation spread, like static building before a storm. At that moment, the intercom crackled to life. The captain's voice was clear, more formal than usual. "Ladies and gentlemen," the voice said, bringing every small movement in the cabin to a halt. "Our flight will be accompanied for training purposes by 2 F-35 aircraft for a short segment." All eyes turned toward the windows. Harris lifted his head, the half-smile on his face, freezing for an instant. Anna turned to her grandfather. The old man was still sitting there, seat 16A, his eyes lifted toward the sky, calm as if he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. "What do you think Harris's reaction will be when the sky begins to answer on behalf of the old man?" The announcement had barely ended when the business class cabin seemed to be pulled out of the heavy stillness that had lingered since the beginning of the flight. Whispers rose almost simultaneously, spreading along the rows of seats. A few passengers abandoned their relaxed postures entirely, leaning close to the windows, trying to look outside before the image became clear. Light reflected from the airplane's wing flickered across the cabin ceiling, signaling that something was approaching very close. Anna leaned forward, her eyes widening. "Look," she whispered, her hand unconsciously touching her grandfather's hand. The old man did not turn around. His gaze had already been fixed on the sky, as if he needed no reminder. 2 fighter jets appeared off the right wing, their gray, steel bodies gliding past at a distance, close enough for their sharp contours to be clearly seen. They held a steady formation, sunlight sliding across their metal surfaces like thin knife streaks. The business class cabin buzzed with excitement. A few gasps sounded. Some people raised their phones to take pictures. Others leaned in to whisper bits of information overheard from somewhere. Harris half stood up from his seat, leaning close to the window. "F-35, he said, his voice carrying a knowing tone. "5th generation, stealth, integrated sensors, just the government's expensive toys." He gave a dismissive laugh, as if he had just delivered a sharp remark. "Each hour of flight costs as much as an average person's entire year's salary." A man in the adjacent row nodded. "I hear they're very hard to detect," he said. "Hard," Harris replied. "Not impossible. Technology always has a way to be surpassed. I work in tech, I know." Anna looked at Harris, then turned to her grandfather. The old man remained seated, his back against the chair, his eyes never leaving the sky where the 2 F-35 jets were maintaining a parallel distance with the airliner. There was no surprise, No excitement, only a quiet focus, as if he were observing something familiar. Inside the cockpit of one of the fighter jets, the radio crackled, clear and brief. Ghost control. Confirm passenger seat, 16A. The voice was even and procedural, but there was a very slight pause after the seat number. The lead pilot stiffened, his hand tightened on the control stick, his eyes flicking quickly across the displays in front of him. Repeat call sign, he said, his voice lower. Ghost. The controller replied, seat 16A. The cockpit fell silent for a brief moment, long enough for the pilot's breathing to slow. He glanced at the co-pilot, catching the other man's eyes as they, too, fixed in focused attention. Confirm identity again, he said. Are you certain? The reply came slowly. Confirmed. Old call sign. Ghost. Back in the business class cabin, Harris turned to Anna and the old man. What the hell is Ghost? He asked, half joking, half curious. An operation name, or some nickname you guys like to give each other. Anna did not answer. She was staring out the window, her heart beating faster. The two F-35 jets were still there, unchanged in formation, not accelerating, as if standing guard. The initial excitement in the cabin gradually shifted into a tense curiosity. Claire stood up from her seat farther back and stepped into the aisle to get a clearer look. Her eyes did not leave row 16. She was not looking at Harris, nor at the fighter jets, but at the old man, as if trying to confirm something. Harris crossed his arms and leaned back against his seat. Whatever it is, it's just training, he said. Young pilots showing off. The old man still did not turn around. Light from the window illuminated his face, highlighting the deep, calm wrinkles. He tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something that made no sound within the cabin. In the cockpit of the F-35, the lead pilot took a deep breath. We need further confirmation, he said. If it really is him. The co-pilot did not finish the sentence. He nodded, his expression hardening. I thought he was dead. Some names don't die. The lead pilot replied softly. They just disappear. The radio crackled again, short and clear. Request full identity confirmation. A silence followed, longer than before. The control station seemed to weigh every word. Colonel Robert Harlan, the voice said, slow and firm. Call sign Ghost. The business class cabin froze in that instant. Harris straightened, his hand dropping from the seatback. What? He said, his voice stripped of mockery. Which colonel? Anna turned to her grandfather. She saw him close his eyes for a brief second, then open them again. He said nothing, simply continuing to look outside, where the pale blue sky stretched wide ahead. A few passengers whispered the name, as if trying to recall something. Some frowned, others shook their heads. The initial excitement vanished, replaced by a strange feeling, almost reverent. The radio fell silent for several more seconds, longer than all the previous pauses. Then, the lead F-35 pilot's voice came through again, no longer procedural. Is it Colonel Robert Ghost Harlan? The question hung suspended between the sky and the business class cabin, bringing all movement to a halt. Harris turned toward seat 16A, his eyes for the first time lacking contempt, replaced by a confusion he could not hide. Anna held her breath. Claire stood still, her hand gripping the seat back in front of her. The old man remained there, seat 16A, his gaze lifted toward the sky, as if the question did not require his answer, because the sky had already begun to answer for him. The moment the question hung suspended in the air, the business class cabin slipped into a strange state, one where no one was certain how they were supposed to react. The name that had just been spoken was not like ordinary titles. It did not evoke a specific individual, but instead called up a void in the collective memory, something that had once existed and then vanished, leaving behind a feeling that was both unfamiliar and heavy. The radio crackled to life again, and this time the voice from air traffic control no longer hesitated. Confirmed, the voice said clearly, each word delivered slowly and decisively. He is flying home. That short sentence spread through the cabin like a wave. Harris stood frozen, his hand stopping mid-air. That's impossible, he blurted out, his voice far quieter than the words he had spoken earlier. There must be some kind of mistake. Anna raised a hand to cover her mouth. Tears welled up, without any plan at all, spilling down onto the back of her hand. She looked at her grandfather, then turned to the window, as if the sky had just opened a door she had never known existed. She wanted to say something, but her throat tightened, leaving only hurried breaths. The old man closed his eyes for a brief moment. In that instant, the sound of the engines outside seemed to change in tone, no longer the familiar hum of a commercial flight, but something more distant, deeper, as if echoing back from a very different time. When he opened his eyes again, his gaze remained calm, but there was an added depth, as though he had just passed through a long memory. In the cockpit of the lead F-35, the lead pilot kept a firm grip on the control stick. "Confirm formation," he said in a low voice. The co-pilot nodded and made a slight adjustment. The two fighter jets shifted with precision. The distance between them and the civilian aircraft recalibrated, even and steady. Back in the business class cabin, the whispers disappeared. Passengers held their breath, eyes fixed on the windows. Some gripped their armrests tightly, others forgot entirely about taking pictures. The moment felt less like a display and more like the anticipation before a ritual. Harris swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak again. "Ghost is, who is he?" he asked, the mockery gone from his tone this time. "Some kind of colonel." No one answered him. Claire stood in the aisle, her gaze never leaving the old man. She could clearly feel the shift in the air, as if every word Harris had spoken earlier had just been stripped of its meaning. She looked outside, where the two F-35 seconds were holding position, their fuselages tilting slightly in the sunlight. The old man opened his eyes fully and looked straight into the sky. His eyes did not glisten, nor were they wet. There was only a deep focus, as if he were recognizing a familiar signal. Anna saw his hand resting on the armrest tighten slightly, then relax. Suddenly, the two fighter jets began to change their angle of flight. It was not a sudden maneuver, but a synchronized, fluid motion. Their wings dipped in the same rhythm, a brief, precise movement, and then returned to their original position. The cabin erupted. Gasps burst out almost simultaneously, mingling with the sharp breaths of those who had just realized they were witnessing something rare. A few passengers covered their mouths, and some jumped to their feet on instinct before sitting back down. Astonishment spread faster than any explanation could. Harris stood motionless, eyes wide open. He looked outside, then turned back to the old man, as if trying to piece together two images that could not be joined. What are they doing?" he said, his voice hoarse. Anna broke down, crying out loud. She did not try to hide it anymore. Tears fell freely, carrying with them a sense of relief and an emotion she had never experienced before. "Grandpa," she said, her voice cracking, "they're saluting you." The old man did not reply. He inclined his head slightly, very gently, an almost unconscious gesture. It was not pride, nor was it thanks. It was more like an acknowledgement, offered to the sky, to those out there, and to what had already passed. Inside the cockpit of the F-35, the lead pilot pressed the communications button. His voice came through the system, no longer procedural, but clearly charged with emotion. "All units, attention," he said, slightly trembling yet resolute. "Salute to the legendary Ghost." Those words echoed into the business class cabin, requiring no further explanation. Harris lowered his gaze, his hand dropping limply. All his boasting, all his earlier sarcasm, dissolved, leaving behind a heavy void. He realized that the power he believed he held had just been rendered silent by a name he had never understood. The old man remained seated in seat 16A, quietly gazing out at the sky where the two F-35 seconds maintained their parallel formation. Light reflected off the cracked glass of his watch, the second hand continuing its steady movement, marking a moment the business class cabin would never forget. A moment when the past, the present, and the sky met in a silent ritual. After the wing tilt salute, the business class cabin did not erupt immediately. It fell silent for a very brief beat, as if everyone needed a moment to understand that what had just happened was not a performance, but the most formal greeting in the sky. The two F-35 jets held a parallel formation, steady and precise, as if time itself had been calibrated to their rhythm. The radio crackled on again. The voice of the F-35 pilot came through the cabin, clear, calm, without any hint of showmanship. "You have flown more than 200 covert missions," he said, "missions with no names recorded, no announcements made." A few passengers drew in deep breaths. Harris stood frozen, his throat going dry. He glanced at the old man, then back out the window, as if searching for an escape from the words he had spoken earlier. The pilot's voice continued, even and measured, yet carrying an indescribable weight. "You survived in places where no one should survive." The sentence was not emphasized, needed no explanation, yet it was enough for the business class cabin to understand that this was not praise, but acknowledgement. Harris turned pale. The hand he had resting on the armrest trembled slightly. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. His boasts about startups, about the future, about power suddenly became hollow and out of place in this setting. The pilot's tone softened. You saved my father, in 1972. The timbre shifted just enough for those listening to realize this was no longer an official transmission. You pulled him from a burning cockpit in the Laotian jungle. Anna raised a hand to her chest, feeling her heartbeat quicken. She turned to her grandfather and saw him still sitting upright, his gaze fixed outward. There was no pride on his face, no display of emotion, only a deep stillness, as if he were looking back at a very old image. If not for you, the pilot continued, his voice catching despite his effort to remain composed, I would not be here. That sentence released the pressure that had been compressing the cabin since the beginning of the flight. The business class section burst into applause, not polite clapping, but rapid, fervent applause, mixed with heavy breaths and emotional murmurs. A few people sprang to their feet, others turned to embrace the person beside them, as if needing to share the surge of feeling that had just risen. Anna broke down in tears. She did not hide them anymore. Her tears fell onto the back of her grandfather's hand. Grandpa, she said, her voice choking. I didn't know. The old man turned to her and smiled very faintly. You don't need to know everything, he replied. You just need to go home. Harris stood up. He wavered in the first second and had to grip the seat back in front of him to keep his balance. The business class cabin gradually fell quiet as everyone registered his movement. All eyes turned toward him, no longer curious, but waiting. Harris bowed his head deeply. When he spoke, his voice was low and hoarse, utterly unlike his earlier arrogance. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't know. No one responded immediately. This silence was different from the one before. It was not avoidance, but a necessary space for the apology to exist. Harris held his bowed posture for a few more seconds, then slowly sat back down, his gaze avoiding every direction. The F-35 pilot maintained contact for one more moment. We will escort you for a little longer, he said. We wish you a peaceful flight. The old man inclined his head ever so slightly as a reply. The two fighter jets adjusted their formation, still parallel, still close enough to see, then gradually increased their distance. Sunlight slid across the aircraft bodies, leaving brief streaks of light on the windows. The business class cabin returned to a quiet state, but it was no longer a heavy silence. It carried a sense of respect, intertwined with reflection. An elderly man in the row ahead turned around and nodded to the old man. A young woman softly told her companion that she had never witnessed anything like this. Claire stood in the aisle, quietly looking at the old man one more time, then returned to her seat, her expression more subdued. Anna took her grandfather's hand. Are you tired? She asked. No, he replied, just a bit noisy. She laughed through her tears. I guess you're used to it. He did not answer, only looked out at the sky. The watch on his wrist reflected the light. The second hand continued to move, steady and uninterrupted, as if reminding everyone that time still flows, regardless of what has just been spoken. Harris sat motionless, both hands resting on his knees. He looked down at the floor, then up, then down again. There was no longer any defiance in his eyes, only a confusion he could not hide, as if he had just realized that the world was far larger than he had ever believed. The old man remained seated in seat 16. He did not stand, did not speak, did not receive the praise, yet the entire business class cabin had changed the way it saw him. No one looked at him with the same eyes as before. Harris's earlier words dissolved, leaving behind a different silence, deeper and more respectful. The aircraft continued its journey, carrying passengers with newly formed thoughts. Outside, the sky stretched wide, blue and serene, as if everything that had just occurred were only a small moment within a much greater flow. Do you think Ghost's past is made only of glory? Or is there a darker truth still waiting to be revealed? The applause in the business class cabin did not stop immediately. It faded into scattered beats, then dissolved into a kind of noise mixed with emotion that was hard to name. Some people were still standing, others had sat back down, but their eyes had not left seat 16A. The sense of respect that had just formed was still very new, fragile, as if even the slightest impact could shatter it. It was precisely at that moment that Claire stood up. The seat behind her let out a soft sound as she rose abruptly. The laptop in her hands was opened in the air, still trembling with emotion. The sound of the hinge sharper than usual. It was not loud, but it was enough to cut through the remaining echo of the applause. Excuse me, Claire said, her voice sharp and concise, carrying no hesitation. I need to clarify something. The business class cabin fell silent at once. People who had just turned to speak to one another stopped. Harris, who had been looking down, suddenly looked up. He stepped back half a step instinctively, as if he had just felt a chill run down his spine. Who are you? A man in the front asked softly, but Claire did not answer. Her gaze passed over everyone and stopped directly at seat 16A. Harris turned to look at the old man, then at Claire. "What are you trying to do?" he asked, his voice not yet regaining its confidence. Claire took a short breath. "According to federal records," she said, each word delivered slowly and clearly, "Colonel Robert Harlan." She paused for exactly one beat, long enough for the entire business-class cabin to tense. "Has been dead since the year 1986%. The statement fell like a heavy object. Anna jumped to her feet immediately. "What are you talking about?" she said, her voice higher than usual. "You just heard them call who my grandfather is." Harris spun toward Claire. "Are you joking?" he asked. "What are you trying to ruin here?" Claire did not look at Harris. Her eyes remained locked on the old man. "Either you are not Ghost," she continued, her tone unchanged, "or you are someone the entire system tried to bury alive." A wave of murmurs spread through the cabin. The looks that had been full of respect just moments earlier began to waver. Some people frowned, some tilted their heads, some unconsciously slid their seats slightly backward, as if they needed more distance from seat 16A. Anna stepped fully into the aisle. "You have no right," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "You are insulting my grandfather." "I am stating the truth," Claire replied, "or at least the portion of the truth that I have access to." The old man remained seated. He did not turn toward Claire, nor did he look at Anna. His gaze stayed forward, toward the front rows of the cabin, sunk in silence, but the hand resting on the armrest tightened slightly, very lightly. Harris licked his lips. "Wait," he said. "You said he was dead, but just now, the pilot called his name. A title is not legal proof," Claire replied. "I am an investigative journalist. I do not rely on emotion." She turned the laptop toward the cabin. The screen lit up, projecting lines of text, seals, and scanned pages of documents. "Here," she said, "archived records, time of death declaration, administrative decisions, not one, but multiple matching documents." A few passengers leaned closer to look. A woman whispered, "Dead since '86. Harris swallowed. "So what does that mean?" he asked. "These things can be forged." "They can," Claire said, "but not easily. And no one forges an entire chain like this just for fun." Anna turned back toward her grandfather. "Grandpa," she said, "say something." The old man still did not speak. He looked out the window, where the sky had returned to calm. The two F-35 jets, now only distant dots fading away. Light slid across the cracked glass of the watch on his wrist. The second hand, still moving steadily. Claire continued, "If you truly are Robert Harlan," she said, "then you are not just a legend. You are a name that was erased. And erased names always have a reason." Harris stepped back another pace, unconsciously distancing himself from seat 16A. "What are you saying he is?" he asked. "A spy, a traitor." "I have not concluded," Claire replied. "I am only presenting data." The business class cabin grew hot. Whispers overlapped. Some people shook their heads. Some looked at the old man with a new expression, no longer pure respect but mixed with suspicion. Others looked at Claire with irritation, as if she had just shattered something beautiful they had not yet had time to hold on to. Anna turned sharply toward Claire. "What do you want?" she asked. "Do you enjoy doing this?" Claire was silent for 1 second. Then she spoke, her voice lower. "I want the truth not to be mythologized." The old man let out a soft breath. The sound was very faint, but Anna heard it. He turned his head for the first time since Claire had stood up. His eyes were neither fierce nor pleading. They were calm, but deep, as if he had seen this moment coming long ago. Claire met that gaze, and for a very brief instant, she hesitated, but she quickly tightened her grip, holding the laptop more firmly. "And this," she said, turning the screen fully toward the cabin, "is why." The documents came into clearer view. Dense lines of text, highlighted passages. The entire business class cabin leaned forward, as if pulled toward a single point. Anna stood motionless. Harris held his breath. The old man sat still in seat 16A, his eyes fixed on the screen, while the knife called truth had been drawn, suspended in midair, waiting for the moment it would fall. Claire's laptop screen glowed in the business class cabin, now angled fully toward her. Pale blue light reflected onto the faces of those standing nearby, exposing the tension in every gaze. The feeling of having just witnessed something sacred in the sky had not yet settled before it was violently pulled in another direction, colder and sharper. "An unauthorized surveillance program," Claire said, her voice steady but rigid. The text was clearly visible on the screen. Beneath it, bolded paragraphs, faint seals, and administrative codes, not under any publicly acknowledged legal framework. A man standing close to the aisle murmured, "That's impossible." Claire switched to another page. "Violations of international treaties," she continued. "The collection and transfer of data beyond approved authority." She neither rushed nor paused. Each sentence landed at a precise rhythm, as though rehearsed in advance. The cabin filled with murmurs. Whispers spread, overlapping one another. Some people shook their heads repeatedly. Others frowned as they looked back at the old man, then at the screen, then at him again. The certainty formed moments earlier began to fracture into small pieces, pushing the world to the brink of nuclear war. Claire said, this time lifting her eyes to look straight across the business-class cabin. This is not speculation. This is an internal assessment. Anna stepped forward, her voice breaking. Stop, she said. You do not know what actually happened. Claire turned to Anna. I know what the files show, she replied, and I have a responsibility to say it. Harris stood braced against the seat in front of him, one hand gripping the edge as if he needed support. He looked at the screen, then at the old man, his lips moving. Who did we just applaud? He whispered, his voice no longer able to hide its confusion. A woman across the aisle covered her mouth. I cannot believe this, she said. They were greeting him just moments ago. Greeting a legend, someone else replied, but the certainty was gone from the voice. Or greeting a mistake. The old man remained seated in seat 16A. He did not look at the screen, nor at the people around him. His gaze stayed forward, as if every sound in the cabin were merely a passing wave. His hand rested on the armrest, neither gripping nor releasing, holding its familiar position. Claire opened another file. This is the timeline, she said, signing dates, approving authorities, data transmission channels. She pointed to a section, and this is the anomaly. There was no independent oversight. Anna shouted, her voice unsteady. You are being used as a pawn, she said. Someone wants my grandfather dragged down. Claire clenched her teeth. I work for no one, she replied. I am exposing the truth. You call this the truth, Anna said, her hands trembling. Or just a fragment that someone handed to you. The business-class cabin is split clearly into two. On one side were suspicious eyes, seats shifting slightly backward, brows furrowing as they looked toward seat 16A. On the other were those who still held respectful gazes, now mixed with confusion, as if trying to cling to a feeling they had just had without knowing what to anchor it to. Harris spoke up, his voice far quieter than before. If these things are real, he said, then he did something no one was allowed to do. Claire nodded. Yes, she said, and that is why his name was erased. Anna turned to her grandfather. Grandpa, she said, they are saying that you. The old man did not respond. He tilted his head slightly, as if listening to a distant voice that did not exist in the cabin. On his wrist, the cracked glass of his watch caught the light, the second hand, still moving steadily, each tiny tick distinct. Claire looked at the old man, her eyes sharpening. If you are Ghost, she said, then you are not a hero. A wave of reaction passed through the cabin. Some people inhaled sharply, others turned away, unable to look directly. Harris closed his eyes for a brief moment, then opened them and stared at the floor. A hero is someone who complies, Claire continued, not someone who grants himself the right to decide the fate of the entire world. Anna laughed, a dry, fractured sound. You speak as if you were there, she replied. You speak as if you know the choices he had to face. Claire fell silent for a beat, then answered, I do not need to be there to read data. Only then did the old man lift his eyes. He looked directly at Claire. The gaze was not fierce, but it was deep enough to make her pause for a very brief moment. There was no justification in that look, nor any challenge, only familiarity, as though he had seen many people holding files standing before him in this same way. History does not need compassion, Claire continued, as if to steady herself. History needs judgment. The business-class cabin fell completely silent. The whispers stopped. All eyes converged on seat 16A and the glowing laptop screen. Claire closed the final file, her hand resting on the laptop lid. You are a criminal whom history has not yet judged, she said, her voice ice cold. The words dropped into the cabin like a heavy period. Anna stood frozen. Harris collapsed back into his seat, letting out a long breath. A few passengers turned away, as if unable to bear looking directly at the old man now. The old man remained there, in seat 16A, silent. He did not argue, nor did he bow his head. His gaze returned to the window, where the pale blue sky stretched wide. The aircraft continued its journey, carrying a business-class cabin torn between the threshold of reverence and the abyss of doubt, while the question of the man called Ghost hovered, still without a place to land. The business cabin was no longer an aircraft cabin. It turned into an improvised courtroom, where every gaze was a question, every silence an unspoken accusation. The rounds of applause, The gasps of amazement from moments before were now only distant luxuries, replaced by vigilance and suspicion. Anna stood in the aisle, her hands trembling. She looked at Claire, then scanned the cabin, as if searching for a point of support that had vanished. "You don't know what my grandfather sacrificed," she said, her voice breaking. "You weren't there. You only look at documents." Claire did not avoid her. "Sacrifice does not allow one to break the law," she replied, her voice cold and firm. "If everyone grants themselves the right to cross boundaries, this world will no longer have order." "Whose order?" Anna asked, her eyes red and swollen. "The order of people sitting safely behind desks." A few passengers shifted in their seats, as if wanting to move away from the center of the confrontation. Harris sank deeper into his seat, his eyes sweeping over the faces turned toward seat 16A, then quickly dropping. He no longer had a place to stand on either side, nor the courage to look straight ahead. A man in a window-side row whispered to the person beside him. "Another legend collapsing," he said, his voice unable to hide its weariness. "It's always like this." Those words spread, not loudly, but enough to weigh down the business cabin further. One woman nodded faintly, as if she had been waiting for this moment. Another turned away, avoiding the old man's gaze. The old man placed his hand on the cracked watch on his wrist. It was not a gesture of pleading, nor of resistance. He simply placed his hand there, familiarly, like an old habit. The second hand kept moving, each small, steady tick indifferent to the words hanging in the air around it. "You call that data," Anna said, turning back to Claire. "But data doesn't tell you what he had to choose between." Claire pressed her lips together. "I don't need emotions," she replied. "I need the truth." "Which version of the truth do you need?" Anna asked back. "The version that makes you believe you are the bravest person in this cabin." Claire narrowed her eyes. "You're attacking me personally." "I'm protecting my grandfather," Anna said, her voice low but clear. "And I see you doing this far too easily." The business cabin murmured again. Some passengers began to lean toward Claire, persuaded by the certainty in her voice. Others looked at Anna and saw in her a real desperation, one not recorded in any file. Harris swallowed hard. He looked up, about to say something, then stopped. His silence now carried no arrogance, only complete retreat. Claire inhaled, as if to conclude the debate. "I didn't come here to be liked," she said. "I came to reveal what has been hidden." "And you think you're standing outside of this?" Anna replied. "You think you aren't being used." Claire hesitated for a brief beat, then regained her hardness. "I choose to believe the documents," she said. The old man looked at Anna, then at Claire. His gaze carried neither reproach nor pleading. It was like the look of someone who had once stood before choices no one else wanted to bear. He gently adjusted his wrist so that the watch sat more neatly. "What are we doing?" Another passenger spoke up, his voice wavering. "We just honored him, and now we're preparing to condemn him. That's how history works," Claire replied. "No one is exempt." Anna turned to her grandfather. "Grandpa," she said, almost pleading, "they're turning you into something else." The old man shook his head slightly. "They're only looking from far away," he replied, his voice deep and even. "It's all right." Those words did not calm the business cabin. On the contrary, they left some people even more unsettled, as if that calmness itself were evidence of something hard to name. At that moment, the radio came on. The sound burst out suddenly, cutting through every whisper. Several people startled and looked up toward the cabin ceiling. The voice of the lead F-35 pilot came through, no longer ceremonial as before. It was low, slow, and carried an unmistakable familiarity. "Claire." The voice called her name directly. "Stop." The business cabin fell dead silent. Not a single murmur, not a single shifting seat. Everything froze, as if the air had been pulled out of this enclosed space. Claire snapped toward the speaker. Her face changed in an instant, from certainty to alertness. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice sharpening. "Who are you to dare give me orders?" The question hung in the cabin, heavy and defiant. Anna held her breath. Harris lifted his head, eyes wide. The old man remained seated in seat 16A, his hand resting on the cracked watch, the second hand continuing to move, as if counting down to another truth, deeper and more dangerous. "If the truth you believe in is someone else's weapon, would you dare to face it?" As Claire's question still hung in the air, the voice from the radio sounded again. This time, it was no longer a vague intervention but a confrontation. The business class cabin remained frozen, as if any movement might shatter the moment taking shape. The F-35 pilot spoke slowly, each word carefully weighed, heavy as steel, dropping onto the invisible floor of the cabin. "In 1985, he said, Robert Harlan received an order that none of us would ever want to receive. A few passengers lifted their heads slightly, as if that year had just been pulled out of the history books and placed squarely in the middle of the cabin. Anna stood still, both hands clenched tight, her eyes fixed on the ceiling where the sound was coming from. Robert Harlan disobeyed the order. The pilot continued. There was no evasion, no softening of the words. The sentence was released bare and final. Claire tightened her grip on the laptop. Disobeyed, she repeated, as if trying to hold the word firmly in her hands. To prevent an automatic nuclear retaliation, the pilot went on. His voice did not rise, but the weight of the statement made the cabin seem to sink. Passengers held their breath. A man near the window raised a hand to cover his mouth. Another lowered his head, as if unwilling to face the meaning of what had just been spoken. Anna turned to her grandfather. The old man remained seated, his gaze forward, but his shoulders dropped slightly, as if part of a burden had finally been set down after many years. If that order had been carried out, the pilot said, pausing long enough for everyone to understand that what followed was not a distant hypothetical, we would not be sitting here. The sentence needed no emphasis. It stood on its own, cold and clear. The business class cabin sank into absolute silence. No murmurs, no whispers remained, only the steady hum of the engines and the breathing of people struggling to absorb what they had just heard. Harris let out a very soft sound. "My God," he whispered. He looked down at his hands, then lifted his eyes toward seat 16A, as if understanding for the first time that his world had once been preserved by decisions he had never been forced to face. Claire raised her head, her eyes no longer as sharp as before, yet still firm. "You're saying he made that decision on his own," she said. "You're saying one individual overrode the entire system." The pilot fell silent for a brief beat. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "I'm saying the system was designed to react quickly," he replied, "so quickly that there was no room left for human thought, and he thought he had the right to stop it." Claire said, her voice tense. "He thought he had the responsibility." The pilot corrected, "There are moments when compliance equals annihilation." Another passenger spoke softly, his voice trembling. "What if he was wrong? Then we would not be here." The pilot replied, and there would be no one left to ask that question. Anna exhaled. A long breath she did not know she had been holding. "Then why?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Why was he erased?" The radio went silent for a moment, as if the person on the other end also needed to choose his words. "Because the system does not forgive those who refuse to kneel," the pilot said. "The system needs to be believed to be infallible." Claire lowered her gaze to the screen. The documents she had presented with such confidence now looked entirely different. She flipped back one page, then another. "These assessments," she said, almost to herself, "they were written after the event." "Yes," the pilot replied, "and they were edited." Harris lifted his head. "Edited?" he asked. "You mean falsified?" "Not entirely," the pilot said. "Censored." Claire stopped moving her hands. "Censored what?" she asked. "The context," the pilot answered. "The chain of decisions, the warnings that were ignored." A passenger let out a heavy breath. "So what we're seeing is a one-sided story," the pilot finished. The old man turned his head slightly toward Claire. His eyes met hers for a brief moment. There was no reproach in them, only a quiet acknowledgement, as if he were accustomed to watching the truth being broken apart and rearranged. Claire closed her eyes for a second, then opened them. "Do you have proof?" she asked, "or is this just another story?" "Yes," the pilot replied, "and that is why I asked you to stop." The business class cabin leaned forward, as if the entire space were waiting for the next sentence. Harris gripped the armrest tightly. Anna stared at the ceiling. The old man remained seated in seat 16A, his hand resting on the cracked watch, its second hand continuing to tick steadily. The pilot drew in a breath. "And the documents you're holding," he said slowly, "have been altered." The sentence fell into the cabin like a clean cut. Claire bent over the laptop, her expression shifting from rigidity to doubt. The business class cabin was no longer a place of judgment, but a place where every verdict had been suspended, waiting for a greater truth to step out of the shadows. After the statement about the documents having been altered, the business class cabin did not react immediately. No one spoke up to argue, and no one rushed to conclude. The certainty Claire had carried with her since the beginning of the flight was now gouged open by a deep hole, and that emptiness began to swallow everything in return. The radio came alive once more. The voice of the F-35 pilot was neither raised nor sharp, but cold enough to cut through whatever emotions remained. "The metadata has been tampered with," he said. "The timestamps do not match the original access chain." Claire lowered her head toward the laptop by reflex. Both hands rested on the keyboard, her fingers freezing for a brief beat. "That's not possible," she said quietly. "I checked it. Missing S, 9-level authentication signatures. The pilot continued. On the most critical documents, a few passengers turned to look at Claire. Their eyes were no longer as sharp as before, but they had not yet softened into sympathy. It was the look of people who had just realized the ground beneath their feet was not as solid as they had imagined. Claire reopened the first file, then the second. The familiar lines of text appeared, but the feeling was no longer the same. She zoomed in on a section, scrolling quickly down to the technical information. Sweat broke out at her temples. "No," she whispered. "That can't be." Anna stood close to seat 16A, watching every movement Claire made. "What do you see?" she asked, her voice trembling. Claire did not answer right away. She opened the original file, the one she had previously believed to be the untouched archive. The parameters appeared, cold and precise. She stopped at one line, scrolled up, then scrolled down. Her breathing quickened. "The modification time," she said. This time, not addressing anyone in particular. "It's been falsified." Sharp intakes of breath rippled through the business class cabin. Harris raised a hand to his forehead and leaned back fully into his seat. "So," he said softly, "everything we just heard was a reconstructed version," the pilot said over the radio. "Accurate enough to convince, wrong enough to kill a man a second time." Anna turned to her grandfather. She looked at him, then at Claire, then at the passengers who were slowly beginning to understand. "They want my grandfather to die one more time," she said, her voice tightening. "Not physically." Claire closed the laptop, then opened it again, as if she still could not accept what had just appeared before her eyes. Her hands were visibly shaking. "This time," she whispered, "it's about honor." That sentence needed no explanation. The business class cabin understood its meaning all too clearly. Killing someone's honor is sometimes far easier than killing them by force. All it takes is a story that sounds convincing enough, a chain of data complex enough, and a person who believes they are doing the right thing. Harris turned to Claire. "You were used," he said hoarsely. There was no sarcasm left, no defensiveness. "You're just like us, only you got there earlier." Claire closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them, her gaze was no longer cold and sharp, but something fractured from within. "I trusted the documents," she said. "I trusted the process, and they knew that," the pilot replied. "They knew who would believe, and who would repeat the story they needed." An older passenger shook his head slightly. "So it was all just a chess game?" "No," Anna said, turning back. "It was a purge." The old man remained seated in seat 16A. He did not look at the laptop, nor did he look at the radio. He watched the faces changing around him, as if he were used to seeing the truth arrive late. When Anna spoke, he placed his hand over hers, the touch light but firm. "It's all right," he said. "This has happened before." Claire looked up at him. Her eyes met his, and this time she could no longer maintain her professional distance. "You knew," she said. "You knew they would do this." "I suspected it," he replied, "because it's the easiest way." The radio crackled again, the pilot's voice lower than before. "There are people who refuse to kneel," he said, "and the system always needs a story to make them disappear." The business class cabin fell silent, not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of realization. The passengers who had just taken part in an impromptu trial now understood that they had nearly become jurors for a verdict prepared long ago. Claire looked back at the files on the screen. She began marking, copying, and opening deeper and deeper layers of data. There was no more haste, only a taut concentration, entirely different from before. "I can trace the source of the alterations," she said. "Not immediately, but I can." Harris let out a long breath. "And then what?" he asked. "What are you going to do?" Claire looked up. "Correct it," she replied. "If there's still time." Anna looked at her, her gaze no longer driven only by anger. "Are you sure?" she asked. "They won't leave you alone." Claire nodded slowly. "I know." The old man looked at the two women standing before him, then turned to the window. The sky was still pale blue and calm, as if unaware that inside this cabin, another confrontation was unfolding. Quieter, but no less dangerous. The radio delivered its final sentence, the pilot's voice unwavering. "This is how the system kills those who refuse to kneel." The words fell into the cabin like a reversed verdict, not meant for the old man, but for those who had tried to rewrite the story. Claire closed the laptop. Her hands shook less now, but her eyes still held the shock intact. The business class cabin was no longer divided into sides, but stood together before a truth that had just been laid bare, waiting for the final part of the story to be told. The aircraft began its descent. The familiar sound of the fuselage vibrating softly filled the air, deep and steady, like a long exhale after hours of tension. The business class cabin was no longer divided, nor was it filled with whispers. The faces seated there shared the same hard-to-name expression: exhaustion, contemplation, and the feeling of having lost something while gaining something else, deeper and heavier. The old man in seat 16 continued to look out the window. The sky gradually shifted in color, the clouds sank lower, and the light softened. Anna sat close beside him, holding his hand without speaking. She could clearly feel the rhythm of his hand, firm and steady, as if everything that had just happened had not shaken him at all. Claire stood in the aisle, her laptop already closed. Her face no longer carried the sharpness of someone holding evidence, nor the absolute confidence of someone who believed she possessed the whole truth. She looked at the old man, hesitated, then spoke very softly. The old man turned his head. He looked at Claire, his eyes carrying no judgment. "You were not wrong to seek the truth," he said. His voice was low and clear, needing no elevation to be heard. "What was wrong was the system that taught you to believe in copies." Claire swallowed hard. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said. "I didn't know." "I know," he replied, "because I have met many people like you." The plane trembled more gently as it continued its descent. The seatbelt sign lit up. A few passengers adjusted their posture, but no one took their eyes off seat 16A. Harris sat in the row ahead, his back straight, both hands resting on his knees, no longer carrying the air of someone accustomed to dominating space. He listened, like everyone else. The old man braced himself and stood up when the flight attendant announced preparations for landing. His movement was slow, but steady. The entire cabin reflexively rose halfway, then sat back down, as if afraid of breaking the moment. "I am on this flight," he said, his voice resonating more clearly in the tightening space, "to attend my own funeral." The words stunned the business class cabin. Anna turned to him, her eyes wide. Claire froze, her hand unconsciously gripping the seat. Harris lifted his head, breathing heavily. "To protect my family," he continued. "I had to die." He paused for a beat, long enough for everyone to understand that the death he spoke of did not exist only in a form, a death that was recorded, stamped, and believed to be real. No one interrupted, no one asked questions. The story guided itself. "Today," he said, "I am allowed to return." A collective sigh spread through the cabin, as if many people were releasing an invisible burden at the same time. Anna covered her mouth, tears falling silently. She did not sob. She cried like someone who had just realized that her grandfather's years of silence were not weakness, but the price of keeping a promise. Claire raised a hand to her face, then lowered it. Her eyes were red. "I almost," she said, unable to finish the sentence. "I almost did something irreversible." "You stopped," he replied, "and that is enough to begin fixing things." Harris stood up. He bowed his head very low. "I thought I represented the future," he said, his voice hoarse, "but I didn't know whose shoulders I was standing on." The old man looked at Harris, neither smiling nor cold. "The future needs the past," he said. "It just doesn't like to admit it." The plane shuddered lightly once more. The runway appeared through the window. Reflected light swept across each face. A few passengers nodded, as if they had just received a lesson found in no book. An elderly man in the row ahead turned around, placed a hand on his chest, then nodded to the old man. He said nothing, but it was enough. The flight attendant stood at the front of the cabin, eyes wet, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, please prepare for landing." The old man sat back down in seat 16A. Anna held his hand tighter. Claire returned to her seat but did not take her eyes off him. Harris sat down, back straight, silent. When the aircraft wheels touched the ground, the business class cabin jolted with a decisive thump. The steady rolling sound began. No one applauded. No one spoke loudly. The silence now was no longer avoidance, but respect. The old man slowly looked around the cabin. "I am not a hero," he said. "I am just someone who was once suspected, despised, and erased from history." He paused, his gaze passing over Harris, over Claire, over faces that had once looked away, just like many of you. Harris bowed his head once more. Claire broke into tears, unhidden. Anna rested her head on her grandfather's shoulder. The old man spoke his final sentence, his voice low, not loud, but hard as steel. "Bullies always think they are strong, until they realize they are standing on the shoulders of those they look down on." The plane continued taxiing toward the gate. The cabin doors had not yet opened, but something had already closed. The funeral of a person who was never allowed to live had ended, not with wreaths or eulogies, but with the return of a name, a truth, and a dignity. Will you stand with power, or with those erased from history? The story ends here, but its echo does not stop on that flight. Seat 16A is no longer just a designation. It has become a reminder that history is not written only by the loudest voices, but also by those who were forced into silence so that others could live. There are truths buried very deep, not because they are wrong, but because they make power fragile, and some people are only seen when the sky speaks on their behalf. If you have walked with this story to the very end, perhaps you are also asking yourself where you would stand when the truth is no longer simple, when right and wrong do not fit neatly into records or hasty judgments. Many more stories about people erased from history, secrets once concealed, and choices that changed the fate of many generations are still waiting to be told. Follow and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss those journeys. Every follow you give is a way for forgotten stories to have a chance to speak again, and perhaps, in a story yet to come, you will recognize yourself.